At 6:37 a.m., the office didn't feel like an office. It felt like a system about to make a mistake it didn't yet understand. The kind of mistake that doesn't explode immediately, but rewrites outcomes quietly, almost elegantly. When the CEO dismissed compliance with a wave of impatience, most people in the room nodded. Not because they agreed, because they were trained to. Because speed sounds like leadership when pressure is high. But she didn't nod. She didn't argue either. No raised voice, no resistance, just a small, almost invisible shift, the kind you only notice later when everything starts to unravel. She closed her laptop, and in that moment, something far bigger than a meeting ended. What no one in that room realized yet was that the $80 million deal wasn't structured around ambition. It was structured around her. At 6:37 a.m., the office lights were already too bright for the hour, as if someone had tried to force clarity before the day had earned it. Screens glowed, coffee sat untouched. Conversations were sharper than usual, stripped of small talk, reduced to fragments of urgency. The $80 million deal had reached that fragile phase where everything looks finished, until someone asks the wrong question, and she was the one who usually asked it. She sat slightly to the side of the main table, not hidden, not central. Precisely where someone sits when their role isn't to lead the conversation, but to define its limits. The CEO stood. No notes, no hesitation. His tone carried the kind of impatience that often gets mistaken for decisiveness. "We're done reviewing," he said, glancing briefly at the clock. "We move forward today." A few heads nodded immediately. Others followed half a second later, the familiar rhythm of alignment. Then came the line. "Forget compliance." It didn't land as a shock. It landed as permission. Permission to stop questioning. Permission to move faster than the structure allowed. Permission to treat safeguards as obstacles. For most people in the room, it simplified everything. For her, it clarified everything. She didn't react instantly. That was the first thing you noticed. If you were paying attention, no visible disagreement, no tightening of expression, just a stillness that felt deliberate, because she understood something the room didn't yet see. This wasn't about skipping a step. It was about removing a condition the entire deal was built on. Her laptop was open. The screen reflected lines of structured validation, clauses, dependencies, approvals, not noise, not bureaucracy, a map. And in that map, Section 12 wasn't a detail, it was a lock. Without it, nothing downstream had meaning. "Legal will catch up," someone added quickly, almost helpfully, trying to smooth the edge of the CEO's statement. She looked at him, not sharply, not critically, just long enough to register the assumption. Legal doesn't catch up to structure. It enforces it. But she didn't say that out loud. Instead, she closed her laptop. No sound, no gesture. Just a precise movement that felt out of place in a room full of acceleration. A small act. But in that moment, it functioned like a signature, not approval, withdrawal. Across the table, someone frowned slightly, as if something didn't align, but they couldn't yet articulate what. The CEO didn't notice, or chose not to. "Good," he said, already moving on. "Let's finalize." Finalize what? The question didn't get asked, because the room was still operating on momentum, and momentum is convincing. It makes incomplete things feel inevitable, but she had already stepped outside of it. Not physically, structurally, because she knew exactly what would happen next, not as prediction, but as consequence. Without compliance validation, the approval chain would appear intact. For a moment, documents would circulate, signatures would align, confidence would hold, until the system reached the one point it couldn't bypass, Section 12, and when it did, there would be no warning. No gradual failure, just a stop, clean, immediate, absolute. She stood up, not abruptly, not slowly, with the same precision she applied to everything else. Someone almost spoke, then didn't, because something in the room had shifted. Subtly. Not enough to interrupt the meeting. Just enough to register. Later. As she walked toward the door, the CEO's voice continued behind her. Confident, uninterrupted, already describing outcomes that assumed completion. Assumptions layered on assumptions. None of them tested. Not anymore. The door closed softly. And inside the room, everything continued exactly as planned. For now. But outside that room, the structure had already begun to separate from the narrative. The deal was still moving, but it was no longer valid, and no one at the table realized that the only person who could make it real again had just left. At first, nothing broke. That was the most dangerous part. The meeting ended with the same confident cadence it began with. Decisions recorded, responsibilities assigned, timelines compressed just enough to feel ambitious. Someone even made a quiet joke near the door, the kind people use to signal that everything is under control. Because on the surface, everything was. The documents moved exactly as they were supposed to. Drafts finalized, numbers confirmed, attachments aligned. The $80 million deal flowed through inboxes like a well-rehearsed sequence, each step reinforcing the illusion that structure and momentum were the same thing. They weren't, but no one challenged it. Not anymore. By 7:12 a.m., the first round of approvals had already been logged. Mid-level managers signed without hesitation. Why wouldn't they? The CEO had already defined the direction. Compliance had been handled. The language was vague, but the authority behind it was clear enough to silence doubt. And doubt in environments like this rarely disappears. It just becomes private. Someone in finance paused for a second longer than usual before approving. Another person in legal opened the file, scrolled halfway, then closed it again. Not out of negligence, out of pattern recognition they couldn't quite articulate. Something was missing. Not visible. Structural. But momentum doesn't wait for clarity. It replaces it. By 7:21 a.m., the deal reached the external interface, the point where internal certainty meets external validation, a controlled gateway, automated but not passive, designed specifically to catch what people overlook when they move too fast. That's where Section 12 lived. Quietly, precisely, not as a suggestion, as a condition. The system processed the submission. No alerts, no warnings. Just a brief pause, so short most people wouldn't notice it unless they were watching for it. Then it stopped. Not dramatically, decisively. Execution blocked. No escalation. No explanation attached to the surface layer. Just a clean, unambiguous halt that didn't invite interpretation. For a few seconds, no one reacted. Because the interface didn't fail, it didn't crash, it simply refused to proceed. "Try again," someone said, already assuming a minor glitch. They did. Same result. "Check the connection." Connection was fine. Maybe it's a delay. It wasn't. What made it worse was how ordinary everything still looked. The office hadn't shifted into crisis. Phones weren't ringing. No alarms triggered. Just a subtle misalignment between expectation and reality that began to stretch, slowly, across the room. Then someone opened the validation log. That was the moment the silence changed. Because there it was. Exact, unemotional, impossible to reinterpret. Compliance authorization, missing. Contract Section 12 requirement, unmet. Execution status, invalid. No drama, just facts. Across the table, the first real pause appeared. Not hesitation, recognition. Because now it wasn't a system issue, it was a design issue. And design has authors. "Where is she?" someone asked, not loudly but with a precision that cut through the room. No one answered immediately, because everyone already knew. She hadn't left the meeting emotionally, she hadn't protested, she hadn't escalated. She had simply removed the one element the system required to move forward, deliberately, legally, completely. And that realization didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded in layers, each one tightening the situation further. The approvals they had just celebrated? Irrelevant. The timeline they had compressed? Meaningless. The authority they had relied on? Insufficient. Because Section 12 didn't respond to urgency, it didn't respond to hierarchy, it responded to structure, and structure, in this case, had a single point of validation: her. "Call her," someone repeated, this time without confidence. But even as the words left the room, another thought settled in, quieter and far more uncomfortable. This wasn't an oversight. This was alignment. She hadn't forgotten to approve. She hadn't missed a step. She had followed the system exactly as it was designed, and by doing so, she had just stopped an $80 million deal, without raising her voice once. If you've ever seen a room full of authority move forward, only to be stopped by something no one thought to question, this is that moment. Pause for a second. In your workplace, what looks like just a process, but is actually control? Because sometimes the real leverage isn't loud. It doesn't argue. It doesn't interrupt. It simply doesn't move. And everything else stops with it. They called her at 7:29 a.m., not immediately, not impulsively. There was a delay first, the kind that happens when a room full of experienced people tries to solve a problem without admitting what it actually is. They checked logs again, re-ran validation, looped in IT, all the safe explanations, all the explanations that don't involve a person, because once it becomes about a person, it becomes about decisions. And decisions have consequences. By the time the call was made, the tone in the room had already shifted from control to containment. The CEO didn't speak. Not yet. He stood slightly apart now, no longer driving the room forward, but observing it, as if trying to locate the exact point where certainty had turned into friction. The phone rang. Once, twice. Then she answered. No background noise, no hesitation. Just a calm, neutral presence, as if her morning had continued exactly as planned. "Good morning," she said. No tension, no defensiveness. That was the first signal, because people who make mistakes usually bring urgency into their voice. She didn't. "We're seeing a block on the deal," someone began, choosing their words carefully. "The system shows a compliance authorization missing under Contract Section 12. A pause followed. Not long, but precise. Long enough to confirm. Not long enough to suggest uncertainty. "Yes," she said. Just that. No explanation attached. Across the room, several people exchanged quick glances. Not confusion. Alignment. Because now it was explicit. This wasn't a technical issue. It was a position. "We need that authorization to proceed," the voice on the call continued, slightly more formal now, as if shifting into a structured request might restore momentum. Another pause. Then, "No," she replied. Not refusal in tone, refusal in structure. The distinction mattered. "Is there an issue we can resolve?" someone asked quickly, leaning forward, trying to convert the situation into a checklist, something actionable, something fixable. But she didn't respond immediately, because the issue wasn't operational, it was foundational. "At 6:37, she said calmly, "the directive was to proceed without compliance." The room went still, not because the statement was new, because it was now recorded, reframed, placed exactly where it mattered. "Given that instruction," she continued, "I aligned with it." Aligned, not resisted, not challenged. Aligned. And that word did something subtle but decisive to the entire conversation, because alignment means you follow the structure as defined, even when that structure removes itself. "You close the validation," someone said, almost under their breath, finally connecting the sequence. "Yes." No emphasis, no explanation, just confirmation. Across the room, the CEO finally moved, not forward, not toward the table, just slightly, enough to signal that he was now fully inside the moment he had created. "This is not what I meant," he said, measured, controlled, but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. Another pause on the line. Then her response, calm, precise, almost surgical. "Then it should not have been said." No accusation, just logic. And logic in this context was far more difficult to deflect than emotion, because everything that had happened since 6:37 followed exactly from that one instruction. No deviations, no improvisation, just execution. The chairman, who had remained silent until now, stepped in, not loudly, but with the kind of authority that doesn't need volume. "Can the deal proceed?" he asked, "under the current structure?" A clean question, no room for interpretation. "No," she answered. Again, immediate, because the answer had never changed. "What is required?" Another precise question, and this time her response carried the full weight of everything the room had tried to bypass. Compliance validation under Section 12. Simple, unavoidable. The room didn't react instantly, because now they were facing something they hadn't accounted for. Not resistance, dependence. And dependence, when discovered this late in the process, doesn't feel like support. It feels like exposure. The CEO looked at the chairman. The chairman didn't return the look immediately. He was still holding the structure in his mind, reviewing it, not emotionally, but functionally. Because once you understand that the deal cannot exist without a specific condition, the question is no longer how to proceed, it's who defines that condition. And the answer was now unmistakably clear. The call remained open. No one rushed to end it, because everyone in the room understood the same thing at the same time. This conversation wasn't about resolving a block, it was about restoring a system they had just tried to override, and systems like that don't reset instantly. They require acknowledgement, adjustment, and a very specific kind of correction, the kind that doesn't happen in public statements, but changes everything behind them. They didn't end the call. That, more than anything, revealed the shift. Because normally, at this level, conversations like this are closed quickly, contained, redirected, reframed into action. But this time, no one reached for closure, because closure requires control, and control had just moved. The CEO exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, then stepped closer to the table, not to dominate the space, just enough to re-enter it. "We need to move forward," he said, measured, recalibrated. Not the same tone as 637. This one carried awareness, not urgency, consequence. On the line, she didn't respond immediately. Because the statement wasn't wrong, it was incomplete. Everyone in the room felt it. That subtle gap between intention and execution, the place where things either align or fail again. "The structure doesn't allow forward movement," she said finally. "Not under the current state." No resistance, just architecture speaking. Someone from legal leaned forward now, more engaged than before. Not defensive, precise. "If we restore compliance validation under Section 12, he asked, does the pathway reopen without additional exposure? A better question, not how fast can we fix it, but what does the system require to become valid again? Another pause. Then, yes. One word. But this time it carried something new. Possibility. Across the table, shoulders shifted. Not relief yet, but orientation. Because now there was a path. Narrow, defined, non-negotiable. And that last part was the most important. Because everything up to this point had been built on the assumption that pressure could reshape structure. It couldn't. It never could. Then we restore it, the CEO said. Simple, direct. But even as the words landed, something in the room didn't move with them. Because restoring structure isn't a verbal action, it's a positional one. And everyone knew exactly what that meant, even if no one said it out loud. The chairman finally looked up, his gaze moving from the table to the CEO, then briefly toward the phone. Before we proceed, he said, calm but absolute, we need to be clear on one point. The room stilled again, because when he spoke like that, it wasn't about process, it was about definition. Compliance, he continued, is not optional, not at this level, not in this structure. No emphasis, no emotion, just a boundary placed exactly where it had always been, but ignored. The CEO didn't interrupt. That, too, was new. Proceeding without it, the chairman added, doesn't accelerate the deal. A brief pause. It removes it. Silence followed. Not heavy, precise. Because now the logic was complete. There was no ambiguity left to operate inside, no interpretation to lean on, just a clear, structured reality that everyone in the room had to align with or step outside of. The CEO nodded once, slowly, not agreement in the usual sense, recognition. Then, turning slightly toward the phone, "Restore compliance validation under Section 12, he said. "No qualifiers, no conditions, just alignment." On the other end, she didn't respond immediately, and that pause, small, controlled, almost invisible, was the final confirmation, because in that moment, the entire room understood something they hadn't at 6:37. This wasn't about getting her to approve, it was about re-entering the system she governed. "Yes," she said, and this time it sounded different, not because the word changed, but because the structure around it had. Within seconds, the validation pathway reopened, quietly, seamlessly, as if it had never been closed, but everyone knew better, because the difference wasn't technical, it was positional. They hadn't fixed the system, they had corrected themselves, and as the deal began to move again, clean, compliant, finally valid, a realization settled across the room with quiet clarity. Power, in its most effective form, doesn't interrupt. It doesn't argue. It doesn't need to. It defines the conditions under which everything else is allowed to exist. And the moment those conditions are ignored, everything else stops. Not loudly, accurately. By mid-morning, the deal was moving again, clean, structured, valid, but the room it moved through was no longer the same. Not visibly. No one had changed seats. No titles had shifted. No announcements had been made. And yet, everything operated differently, because once a system reveals where its true control lives, you don't unsee it. Emails became shorter, approvals more deliberate. Conversations, stripped of performance, focused only on what actually mattered. No one said, "Move faster" anymore, because they had just seen what speed looks like, without structure, and how quickly it collapses. The CEO remained composed. That part hadn't changed, but the way he moved through the room had. Less projection, more calibration, as if each decision now passed through an additional filter, one that hadn't existed or hadn't been respected just hours earlier. Not hesitation, awareness. Across from him, the chairman closed the file once more, this time without needing to reopen it. The conclusion had already been reached, not about the deal, about the system. Because what had happened wasn't a disruption, it was a demonstration, a precise, almost clinical exposure of where authority ends and dependency begins. And the line between them is thinner than most people think. She returned later, not dramatically, no one announced it, no doors opened wider than usual. She simply walked back into the same space she had left, but the space met her differently. Not with tension, with alignment. There were no apologies. None were needed in that form. Because in environments like this, correction doesn't come through words. It comes through behavior, through decisions that don't repeat the same mistake twice. The CEO acknowledged her with a brief nod. Nothing excessive, but it held weight, measured, intentional, unmistakable. Not deference, recognition. They resumed. Not from the beginning, from the point where structure had been restored. The $80 million deal progressed through its final stages without friction now. Every approval landed where it was supposed to. Every condition met. Every dependency validated. Not faster than before. Better than before. Because now the system wasn't being pushed, it was being followed. And that's when it works best. No one mentioned 637 again. It didn't need to be referenced. It had already been absorbed into the way people paused before speaking, into the way documents were reviewed, into the way silence was no longer treated as absence, but as signal. Because that morning had clarified something most organizations take years to learn, if they learn it at all. Real control doesn't sit in visible authority. It sits in the conditions that authority depends on. Remove those conditions, and even the strongest decisions become irrelevant. Preserve them, and the system holds, quietly, reliably, exactly as designed, and somewhere between a closed laptop at 6:37 and a single word, yes, that reopened everything. The entire company had been reminded of a simple truth. Power isn't in who speaks the loudest. It's in who defines what's allowed to happen next.